liver shunt. The liver has a vein, a portal vein that runs from the gastrointestinal tract, the spleen, the pancreas, and it runs through, it has branches coming off it, but it runs through into the liver, and its main function is for blood supply. And there'll be some byproducts and a few toxins, etc. in there, but it's mostly for blood supply. And that blood supply is incredibly important to the liver, and we can talk about all the stuff that goes on, what happens, and why we have to do a certain diet. Now, what tends to happen, and there are two different kinds that we would talk about, which have the same sort of outcomes, although there are different types within those two different kinds. We will be looking at congenital Porto shunts, and we will be looking at acquired Porto shunts. Now, congenital are definitely from birth. It's probably something that went wrong when birth happened. I can briefly go over that. And acquired is normally secondary to liver disease already, or potentially some liver issues that may have occurred from over medication. I have seen that before. But normally liver shunt is generally from birth. Now, the issue with this, and quite often it's detected around about the 6-week mark, the 6-month mark. The issue with this is dependent on how bad it actually is dependent on how quickly some of the symptoms come on, which we'll also talk about. And therefore, how long does it go undetected? So, we can discuss that as well. So within those different birth defects, you've got the congenital or you've got the acquired Porto shunt. Basically what happens is this portal vein that runs all the way through to the liver with blood supply shunts off and goes, basically shunt means alternate route, and it goes off in a different direction and quite often spills into the blood system. So this is an issue if you've got toxins and byproducts and so on, and also an issue because you're stopping that blood flow going into the liver, which is incredibly important for a healthy, robust liver, particularly early years when it's growing and forming and so on. Now, what's difficult with a liver shunt diet, we would definitely be going lower protein. Now, I always talk about lower phosphates when we're looking at different kidney disorders. Now, yes, definitely I do look at the phosphate levels, but we definitely need lower protein, which I normally look at around about 8-10% maximum, which is quite difficult to do when you're really looking at a truly carnivorous diet. And obviously, if you do have to follow that kind of diet when you have a puppy, that's also rather difficult. We try our very best to accommodate where we can and do the best that we can given the situation. Lots of protein is actually required for growth. So, it's one of those things that it definitely needs to be reduced. Now, we're always talking about reducing protein in liver shunts, but actually I find you need to keep the fats down as well. The liver is powerhouse. It metabolizes, synthesizes, and detoxifies pretty much everything you could possibly think of. It also produces lots of different hormones. Now, when you've got protein, liver, protein, fat, and carbohydrates coming into the liver, they need to be broken down accordingly and repackaged up and sent off around the body. And that's the way it goes. So what you would generally find is if that's not working effectively, your dog isn't going to be getting the protein that is required anyway. And you also don't want to overburden the liver with a high fat diet either, because you're going to be putting more stress and strain. The liver's going to be producing more bile, and bile acids often end up being higher in dogs that have liver shunt anyway. So it's just not something you want to do. So I tend to look for a lower protein, lower fat diet, which in theory sounds okay, but it can be really difficult to formulate, particularly if you're maybe looking at other issues as well. So we'll talk about the foods and stuff in a short while. One of the reasons it tends to happen, if it's congenital, and I'm reading this because I know I won't say it properly otherwise, that in all mammals, in all mammal fetuses, there is a liver shunt there anyway. And it's called a ductus venosus, and that actually carries blood from the liver straight up to the heart. Now that cuts off when a mammal is born. So when the dog's born, that would shut off. Now, if that doesn't shut off effectively, or there are other things that don't work or start effectively, like the portal vein, then that's when you start getting this issue with the shunt. You can definitely work with it, and there can be some really great outcomes, but if you don't get it right and it's not caught quickly enough, it doesn't always have an amazing outcome. So what are the clinical signs of liver shunt? A really common one, because obviously protein metabolism, blood flow to the liver is metabolizing everything, detoxifying everything, is going to be stunted growth and general development, that obviously like muscle wastage, and they'll be a little bit smaller than usual. You just know something's a bit off. You also might notice some odd neurological symptoms, like they might stare off into the distance. They might stand still and do this really weird glary thing. Seizures, sometimes stuff with eyes can go on, so eyes can shoot off, even blindness has occurred or can occur if it's not addressed effectively. Circling and head pressing. You can actually get something called hepatic encephalopathy. I can never say that. I haven't had a drink, I swear. And the reason being is because obviously we've got all of these toxins that have come in through the gastrointestinal, all these byproducts that need to go through to the liver that are going straight into the blood system. And that really affects brain function, hence the reason why seizures is actually quite a big one that you might be seeing as well. And the less common, you might see panting and thirst and frequent urination, but actually a lot of those signs tend to fit in with a load of other diseases. Where these are quite specific, you just tend to know something isn't quite right. So how is it diagnosed? It's always diagnosed through blood, so blood analysis. So you'd be looking at liver enzymes, you'd be looking at burn, urea, you would even maybe do urinalysis as well. Sometimes they might find ammonium crystals in there, or protein density might be quite low. So that's definitely one to look out for. What else do they do? Bile acid test, as I said before. What tends to happen is the liver will produce bile acids for fat emulsification, and that will be stored in the gallbladder, and the gallbladder will release that into the intestines accordingly when we need to emulsify fat. Now that will come back round again through the portal vein, and it might not be recycled effectively to then be stored back into the gallbladder. So it can go straight into the blood system, and bile acids end up being really high. Hence the reason why I also quite like to do a low fat diet as well as a low protein diet, just to keep that extra stress and strain, and you're not furthering an issue that's already being challenged. So we've got urinalysis, the bile test, which is a really big one. Just on its own, it's not telling us much, but when you've got raised liver enzymes and urea might be really high, or the bun ratio might not be great. With the albumin as well, sometimes that can be really low, sometimes it can be high. So that's a really important one to look out for. But also sometimes they'll want to have a look and see if they can actually see that shunt. So it might be ultrasound, MRI, a CT scan. There's laparoscopies that they can do, which is very invasive and you try and avoid at all costs. But there are loads of different means for them to actually look and see what's actually going on. Now, the reason why I said there's two different types is because with these veins, with the portal vein, you've also got other veins branching off. Now, there are two different kinds of veins that are going to be involved, and that's going to be extrahepatic cellular or intrahepatic cellular. And that means that if it's on the outside of the liver, it's a lot easier, which is extra. It's a lot easier to try and deal with, particularly if there's just one very obvious shunt. And this is often found in smaller dogs, so Yorkshire Terriers, Cairns, that kind of thing. Now the larger breeds, and this isn't a complete rule, but this is what's commonly seen, in the larger breeds, you will often end up seeing intracellular, which means it'll be on the inside of the liver and therefore much harder to address. So there's actually a process that, like an operation that dogs can go through, particularly at a young age, which is sort of it's a reconnection. And that can be incredibly successful. It's like, I think there's about a 90% success rate if it can be done. But obviously if it's intracellular, it's going to cause more complications and sometimes it's not possible. So there are different variations in terms of how well you can deal with it, but the main thing that a vet would be looking at, and which is why we often get involved with vets, is looking at diet. Diet is the most important part, but also they'd be looking at certain medications like lactulose. Lactulose would help almost bind, detoxify and help with the digestive system to take out some toxins. We actually have some really nice natural alternatives that we sometimes use, can actually be more effective even. And sometimes they look at antibiotics because they're always worried about whatever is in the gastrointestinal tract, if that's coming through into the vein and then bypassing and going straight into the blood system. If there is intestinal infection, if there's dysbiosis, so an overgrowth of bad bacteria, that's never good. So SIBO can actually be quite common in this instance, so small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Now that's all well and good getting rid of that with an antibiotic, but we also know that that's going to lower immunity. It's also going to open up for longer implications with the microbiome, and that's actually long-term not going to be supporting the issue. So then that leads me on to what I would be considering, the factors to consider. So there's diet, and we are definitely going to talk about that. I keep on saying we're going to talk about it, but we are going to talk about that and what we can try and do. But also there are other factors that you definitely want to consider because you need to reduce as much toxins and rebuttal of any kind, and take as much pressure off the system as you possibly can. So that does take me to gut microbiome. That is the biggest thing that you need to be looking after. And actually one of the biggest things you need to be looking after anyway, because everything oscillates around the digestive system. So it's incredibly important that we're supporting that. So I'm always looking for a really good probiotic to help support that. You need to be careful not to go for anything too harsh and release lots of bacteria and yeast and so on. Sometimes if your dog might have yeast or bacterial overgrowth, people will, other practitioners will put in antimicrobial herbs. Sorry, I'm not selecting my words very well today. If you do that, and we know there's a confirmed case of SIBO, it needs to be done so incredibly carefully. And I wouldn't be doing it with a puppy. I would only be looking at doing it after 6 months. And honestly, the first thing I ever do is just look at the diet and the microbiome in terms of probiotic. And then if we need to start looking at a more complicated digestive microbiome balance, then we can start looking at that, where we would be putting more support with the liver itself anyway, not just through diet itself, but through supplementation, carefully I might add. And I do work with a lot of vets on this. I think it's the nicest way. I often share the recipes with them so they know what parameters we're working within. So yes, it's important. So gut microbiome, really, really important. So you need to be taking care of that. Water quality is incredibly important. the toxins that are in our water system are horrifying. Not only have we got like fluoride and things like that actually have no business being in there. We're looking at estradiol, so hormones, pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, lots of different bacteria and virus, and this is all stuff that needs to be dealt with by the gastrointestinal tract, and if whatever's not dealt with in this gastrointestinal tract, it's then got to go to the liver and then the kidneys to be processed as it needs to be. So you don't want that going into the system. So whatever we do, it needs to be the cleanest possible approach we can possibly do. So you're looking at water quality, I definitely would filter. There are some really good companies. There's Berkey Water System, which is America, but they sell in the UK. There's Life Straw, they're American, they sell in the UK, the EU. There's also Fox, which is a Glaswegian company, which, Lisa, you'll be pleased to know I actually bought one, which I'm sure you don't need more than one water system, but I have to. So that's really good, and it filtrates through pretty much all of that stuff that I just spoke about. So it just means that you're giving them a much better water. Lots of people say, I'll bottled. Yeah, but then you've got the issues of plastics, PCBs leaking into the water. How long has that water been sitting somewhere? Has it ever sweat in the bottle? Has it got hot? They're all things, and just plastics. We don't need to be using them. If you can get a good water filter system, you don't need it. So that's something I would definitely do. Additional exposure to chemicals. So I get rid of flea treatments and worming treatments. Now, this can be really controversial with vets, and again, I always work with them. That needs to be metabolised by the liver. You can't, and if it's not and it's going around the body, you're definitely looking at neurological issues. Flea treatments, flea and tick treatments are actually known as neurotoxic. So they paralyse fleas and ticks and so on. So that's not something you want consistently circulating around. It has a really long life anyway in the body. So not good. So there's lots of natural things that you can do there. We've got, I can actually post that. We've got a really great little article on that and the stuff that you can use naturally. And with worming, if you said to your vet, can you guarantee me that my dog will never get worms on this? He'd have to say no, because the data's not there. In fact, I've had people come to me who've been consistently worming, and those animals have still tested positive for, say, low foxworm burden. So it doesn't guarantee anything. They're not a prophylactic, they're a treatment. So if they're a treatment, why wouldn't you screen first? So there are a couple of companies. I'm really sorry. I will find out if there's anybody in America who wants to know a worming screen test centre. I do have one, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. I might need to grab it off Carla, actually. But there's two in the UK. Feet Lab, there's actually a couple more, but there's Feet Lab, there's Worm Count, actually there's Slobber Chops, they do one as well. And you just test every 3 months just to keep on top of things, just to see where you're at. And if anything happens, then you would deal with it. And you can actually deal with it naturally and then retest and see where they're at. But also if you really needed to give chemicals, then obviously, you could. I'm not trying to bypass your vet. But any additional exposure, if they're in pain and they're on pain medication, the irony is it's actually just circulating around the system and it's not being metabolized properly by the liver. So, it's really important that we try and reduce it so that they're not in pain anyway. They're comfortable, they're on the right diet, they're being supported effectively with the gut microbiome and the liver. We're not adding extra toxins in the house, so it's not in the water. I'm doing that because I'm pointing to my water bowl. But also looking at household chemicals. What are you cleaning the floors with? What are you cleaning your beds with? What are you putting in the dishwasher? What are you doing in the... I don't have a dishwasher. I am the dishwasher. I don't know why I've never liked dishwashers. I am rapidly thinking I might invest in one though. But eco, you want to go for something that's natural, no chemicals, because those chemicals, they sit on bowls. What kind of bowl have you got? You know, go for a really good ceramic bowl, go for a bamboo bowl or a plate, like a platter. You want to stay away from, you know, the stainless steel and any of the plastics, that's for sure. There's Biko bowls, there's loads of stuff that you can grab. Obviously, I've just mentioned pharmaceuticals. You do need to be really careful, so I wouldn't be giving them willy-nilly. Certainly not the flea and worming treatments without looking at alternatives. And then vaccinations, because those vaccinations titer test. Speak to your vet and say you want to titer test, unless you're in America and there are certain states that insist on that not being an option. Titer testing is really important. Check out the WSAVA, they're actually doing something at the moment. It's about 7.5, coming into 8 years now. All puppies just initially vaccinated. There was some cats in it as well, I believe. Just the very initial, not even the boosters. And they are still inoculated against those said diseases. And all they do is they titer test, they check for blood antibody titers in the blood. And your vet can easily go and order one from a company like VaxiCheck in the UK. There's other companies in America as well. And they do rabies titer in America as well, and Canada. So really, really important. You don't need to be activating the immune system and pouring in toxins, because vaccinations contain adjuvants. They've got mercury, aluminium hydroxide, arsenic. Where does anybody think that's going? You know, it's circulating around the body, it sits in tissue, it can activate poor genes, and how is it detoxified? You know, so it's putting more pressure on the liver, ultimately. So, maintaining a normal metabolic, easily digestible diet, we're going to look at macronutrients, so proteins, fats, carbs. Okay, so it's definitely a finite balance, and I would go to a professional to get it done. What we are doing, and this isn't trying to bypass our professionalism, because we would ask to see recent blood tests and a diagnosis. But what we will be launching in July are some recipes. Prescription type recipes. Now, we always say try and come and see us, because it's not personalised, and personalised is an incredibly important process, because what's going on for one dog might not be going on for the other. You know, it is difficult, and that will be the same with the prescription diet that you're getting from your vets, and that's ultra processed as well. But I think what's incredibly important is that we look at providing the best fresh diet. So if you can't afford consultation, even if it's not with us, you can go to somebody that can help formulate you the right diet. That's incredibly important. But we are going to have some recipes that will be lower fat, lower phosphate, lower protein, low fat for lots of other liver issues. We're going to have a slightly lower copper. Now, to have access to those, obviously there's a level of screening. We have to make sure that that is suitable for your dog, but we will be having those, because some people can't afford the consultation or don't deem it necessary. And I can't necessarily explain to somebody in a quick email why it's really important. So, I do definitely work at low phosphate foods. So lower phosphate foods are definitely higher, fattier foods generally. So, you know, like ground beef and ground lamb. If I were to use that, it would be in a much smaller portion, added with other things that would be definitely lower protein, because those are still higher protein. Also, red meats are actually going to produce more ammonia, and if that's not being addressed effectively and wrapped up into urea and then excreted through the kidneys, then we've got an issue. So we're always looking at, you know, the bun levels, ammonia levels. Lower protein foods, a couple that I often tend to use that I really like. Now, I'm not pro-grains, but sometimes you have to work with what you've got, and you are really limited in this situation. You know, some people, I've had an email recently from a lady who said, I really want to lower the protein, so I just want you to create something that's got this protein in it, this meat, but at like 40%, and then the rest. It doesn't actually work like that. It's quite a balancing act trying to balance it out. One recipe that I've done recently had oats in it, so organic and non-gluten. And if your dog tolerates that, it's amazing, because it's a great source of, it is a great source of carbohydrate, but there is some protein in there. It can help regulate blood sugars, which is incredibly important with liver shunts. It definitely brings some calorie around, but it keeps the protein down when I'm using other meats in there. It's also keeping it lower fat as well. Now, in amongst that, whilst tripe is much higher protein, it's normally very easily assimilated, and it's really low phosphorus. So for me, you know, like the other day, I created something that I think might have had a bit of egg white in it. Some oats, some tripe, and I think there was some lamb mince, and that I got just at around about 0.5% phosphates, which is exceptional, and around about 8.5% protein, which is pretty good going for a fresh diet. You want it under 50% dry matter. So organic where possible, and also if you're not buying organic, you know, even if you're going to Waitrose or Trader Joe's or wherever it might be, and it doesn't actually say it's organic, excuse me, itchy nose, means I'm going to have a surprise. You don't know what has actually, what those vegetables have even gone through. You know, they might have gone through irradiation so that it gives them a longer shelf life. They may well have had pesticides and herbicides on them themselves, although washed really well. There are certain things that you can do. There's something in the UK, I don't know what it's called in America, called Veggie Wash. And that helps take that sticky lining of pesticides and other things. Apple cider vinegar, you can actually rest that. Not always makes your veggies taste that great. Bicarb of soda, Himalayan salt. You know, you can actually look online and get some really nice recipe type things to clean and to try and get rid of as much residue as possible. Your meats, if you can go organic, at least grass fed. You know, you want to be going free range, antibiotic free, whatever meats you are doing. Oats definitely need to be gluten free and organic. You really need to be thinking about it, maybe adding in a little MCT, taking some pressure off the liver, but adding some fats for energy, I find can be incredibly helpful in this scenario. And I do find, other than the tripe, although you can really lightly cook tripe if you needed to, put it in a pressure cooker or something. I pretty much like to keep, and oats, obviously you need to cook oats, and non-salted. I prefer cooked with liver issues. I don't know why, it seems to metabolise better. I think it must break down the phosphates and the protein to some degree. It definitely denatures protein, so intact protein is coiled, and then as it's cooked it denatures and it uncoils. I mean, you know, in an ideal world, if you had a really healthy pet, I'm always like, you know, raw, it's a species appropriate diet and it's amazing. If you can't get your head around that, freshly cooked or a dehydrated cooked is really great. But we don't often have this luxury with something like this. So egg whites are really good. I'm always trying to use as many whole foods as possible. I'm really careful. I love vegetation, so you know, a bit of sweet potato if your dog's good with sweet potato, or pumpkin, it is really nice, and that can actually help sort of, you know, lower the amount of protein slightly. But with fruit and veg, you do need to be really careful. I really love berries because you've got the paranthocyanins. We know that they're hepatoprotective, so that's really good. We know that we want to be looking at EPA and DHA, so those omega-3 essential fats. Now, you're going to find those in algae, algal, phytoplankton, obviously different fish sources. Always go for a smaller fish source because it's got less toxins in it. So salmon is going to have probably, salmon and tuna, because they're larger fish, are going to be more contaminated probably than, say, your sardines, anchovies, mackerel. So I'm always very careful. Also, if you're putting in an oil, which I definitely recommend, and low polyunsaturated and low omega-3 diets have actually shown to increase inflammation and other issues with liver. So those kind of fats are incredibly important. But I would be really careful about the kind of oils. I would make sure that they're encapsulated and not in oil, so it can't oxidize, because that can cause an awful lot of oxidative damage in the body. I'm careful with high glutamate foods as well. If there is some hepatic encephalopathy, I haven't been drinking, I promise. With shunts, with a shunt diagnosis, they probably are more likely to have a seizure. So I'm really careful with their high glutamate proteins, and they can go down an excitatory pathway, which can interfere with the brain, which is why MCT oil can actually be really helpful sometimes in this scenario. So fats I've covered. I would definitely go a lower fat diet. I want it, around about 7%, maybe a bit lower. The difficult thing is, obviously, with lower protein and lower fat is the amount. If you're working off calorie, the amount of food's going to be greater. And the question is always, do I feed a few times a day, 5 times a day, once a day, a couple of times a day? I wouldn't say once a day, that's too much overload. But it's very individual to the dog. Sometimes with a bit of intermittent fasting, they do really well. Sometimes you have certain dogs that do much better when they're fed, smaller amounts and every so often. I think it's really important to actually judge and see for yourself what's actually working for your dog. And then obviously, if you're working alongside a professional, it's much easier to chat about that and gauge what's working and what's not. Okay, so carbohydrates, generally, obviously we might have something like oats in there. I know rice historically is used quite a lot, but I do prefer oats if I'm going grains. I definitely don't like to use nightshade family, like tomatoes and plain potato and that kind of thing. We actually know that they're not hepato friendly when there's an issue going on with the liver. So I like to look at sort of your leafy greens and so on. They're really, really important. So nightshades, beet, tomatoes, eggplant. We know eggplant can be hepatotoxic. I'm not sure why. I really like krill oil, actually. A clean krill oil, obviously, it contains choline and astaxanthin. Really amazing to look after the liver. So there are certain nutrients, macro and micronutrients, that you need to be looking at, because there are lots of micronutrients, vitamins and minerals that are incredibly important and help in aid for phase 1, phase 2 detoxification pathways of the liver. They will also help with the breakdown of protein into ammonia, the breakdown of fats, and the breakdown of carbohydrates, for example. So vitamins A, C and E, always really important. You need to be careful with A. I don't supplement with A, but some sweet potato with A in it, absolutely fine. I'd be looking at colourful veg definitely for that, minus peppers. All the Bs, so the leafy greens and so on. I would definitely be checking on iron levels. Anemia can be a little bit of an issue because there is some iron metabolism that goes on in the liver. So you'd need to be checking that. Zinc, molybdenum, manganese, magnesium, all of these minerals actually have a really important part to play in liver function. So it's really important that the diet is not only balanced, you know, you don't want to just go, oh, I'm going to throw in some oats, I'm going to throw in some this and that. It needs to be balanced, but you also need to be following guidelines. So we generally follow VEDIAF, but you know, you could do AFCO or NIC, NRC. You definitely need to watch out for deficiencies. I always check for vitamin D. Obviously, being fat soluble, vitamin D and vitamin E, if your vet checks, fantastic. If not, you can actually go and check. It's a bit naughty, but you can use a human testing kit. That's always it's always an option. We won't tell anybody we said that. So yeah, you do need to be careful because obviously fat soluble vitamins are stored in the liver, and some are processed in the liver. And if you've got a lower fat diet, then you know, you might not be getting all those essential vitamins, fat soluble vitamins. So you know, you just need to sort of stay abreast and keep on top of things and make sure that you're supplementing well. And every so often we're checking not only blood and urinalysis and so on for the shunt itself, but you know, just to see how we're going with all the vitamins. I really love the brassica family, so you know, your kale and not so much cauliflower, but definitely cauliflower, kale, love kale, I might have said kale, collard greens and broccoli. They have glucobrassicans, so like indole 3-carbinol, which actually help with the process of detoxification. It particularly help with hormones. So liver detoxifies everything, you know, any possible toxin, chemical, pharmaceutical drug, anything. It has to detoxify and get rid of it alongside the gastrointestinal tract as well. Broccoli also contains choline, which is really good for liver function. As I just said, I love proanthocyanins in the blueberries, the blackberries, the cranberries. You don't want too much in there, but you know, if you just an odd treat and you don't want a protein treat, blueberries are fantastic. Love blueberries. Eggs are really good. You just need to be careful, and that's why it's really good to have a formulated diet, because you can use the egg but within a particular diet, so you're looking at how much protein and how much phosphorus is in there. Really important. But eggs, loads of B vitamins, choline, vitamin D, omegas, really beautiful. I love eggs. They're the most biologically available protein on the planet other than whey. So they are fantastic. Actually, even looking at shiitake and maitake and mushrooms like that, they have D2 and they have hepatoprotective type properties, which is really good. Beta glucans, which are immunosupportive. Now, the biggest thing for me always, and this has to be done carefully because you don't want to overwork the liver, but milk thistle. Milk thistle is an amazing one. It deals with phase 1 and phase 2. I actually quite like Denamarin, which is sold by the vets. And the reason why I do quite like this, there's some additives in there I don't love. But I can get over that bit for the fact that the Denamarin has the silibin and the SAMe, which is a form of amino acid which helps with methylation and liver detoxification. And that really helps look after the liver, obviously done carefully. So you can even speak to your vet about Denamarin. And clay, bentonite clay, as long as your dog isn't prone to constipation, because if you're putting it in food, but actually protect from 4-leaf rover is quite nice because that's got a bit of bentonite clay, but it's got some soil bacteria and Saccharomyces boulardii, and there's a really nice selection of stuff in there. Some blueberries actually. Yeah, you've got some berries in there. It's a really nice digestive support, but also it helps solidify things, but it also helps pull out toxins. And that's ultimately what the lactulose would do from the vets. I mean, I wouldn't just whip out lactulose and then start adding in clay. I'd be clever about it, maybe even speak to your vet. There's a bentonite clay. I mean, I quite often use human supplements, human grade, because I develop them for a living, so I know what I'm recommending. But there's actually, Tammy pointed it out to me. Tammy, I don't know if you're on there. There is one, I think it's JP Holistic, and they do a bentonite clay for cats and dogs. Really good for pulling out toxins because of the way it's charged. It's automatically attracted to histamine, heavy metals, dust particles, anything that's oppositely charged that we don't want in the body. Now, what you do need to be careful of is that you don't put it directly with your food, because it also really likes minerals because of the way they're charged. So yeah, you'll be pulling out some essential nutrients as well. So you do need to be careful with that. But milk thistle most definitely helps to scavenge free radicals. It helps with glutathione regulation. You can actually go directly and use glutathione. It is really fantastic for hepato support, but if you just want a very light liver support, milk thistle and dandelion can be fantastic. Turmeric, burdock, artichoke, all of those. You just need to do it really carefully and at least speak to people who know what they're doing if you're not sure. Always get your vet on board if you can. Some vets don't want to get on board, but that's their prerogative. So ultimately, we advocate a lower protein, lower fat diet. Strip all of the chemicals, as many chemicals as you can. Filter water, clean all the veggies, do as much organic as you possibly can afford. And I appreciate at this time, some of us are just really fortunate we've got the money to feed our dogs. I do appreciate that, but whatever you can do, stretch to what you can do ultimately. But really it's just about getting the right range of nutrients in to help support a dog that's definitively struggling. And look, some go on to prosper really well. It doesn't end up being an issue. So if you've got any more questions, and I'm sorry if anybody's written anything and I've not. JP Holistic, thanks Tammy, you're amazing. If you've got any questions, pop them in. I'm sorry if I've missed them. I don't want to go on too long. It's been 45 minutes. But what I really do want to do is put down some links to the website that might help. So we've got a few on liver shunts and what you'll be looking at. We've got one on bentonite clay and that kind of thing. So I'll actually put up some links. But if you've got any questions, do post them. I'll get back to you. And obviously give us a messenger if you've got something a bit more personal to ask. But thanks for joining us, and any YouTubers, obviously come onto the site and go onto the contact page, and we'll get back to you. We're very good at getting back to you. All right, guys, you take care. Thanks for tuning in. Bye.